"Open this door," I screamed, slamming both fists against the basement door until my knuckles burned. Above me, my father's footsteps stopped. "You should have learned when to keep your mouth shut, Anita." I was 15 years old, barefoot on a concrete floor, with rats scratching behind boxes less than 10 feet away from me. An hour earlier, I had stood in our dining room staring at university brochures spread across the table for my older sister, Melissa. All I had asked was, "Why does Melissa get to keep studying when you pulled me out of school?" Mom's face went cold. "Because she has a future." "What about me?" She leaned toward me. "You're just the spare daughter." Dad actually laughed. "We only kept you for legal reasons." Then they dragged me downstairs. But what frightened me most wasn't the locked door. It was the question Dad shouted through it minutes later. "What papers did you see?" I froze. Because suddenly, this wasn't just punishment. It was fear. The first night, I barely slept. Something moved behind an old cabinet near the furnace. Then came the squeaking. I climbed onto a wooden storage crate and pulled my knees against my chest. "Mom," I yelled. No answer. The next morning, the door opened just wide enough for a plate of toast and a cup of water to slide across the top step. "Please," I said, "I won't ask about Melissa again." Mom remained hidden behind the door. "You should have thought of that before snooping." "I wasn't snooping. The papers were on the table." Silence. Then she asked, "Did you read anything with your name on it?" My stomach tightened. "I don't know." The door slammed shut. That was when I started counting days. I scratched one short line into a wooden support beam every morning. 5 lines became 10. 10 became 20. Whenever they allowed me upstairs to wash, one of them stood outside the bathroom door. I wasn't permitted near the phone. I wasn't allowed into the dining room. And every few days, Dad asked the same strange questions. "What exactly did you see? Did you see any account numbers? Did you tell anyone about Melissa's tuition?" I couldn't understand why they cared. If they hated me as much as they claimed, why were they terrified of what I might know? Weeks later, I heard the basement lock turn. Dad opened the door. "Get upstairs." For one foolish second, I thought it was over. I climbed the stairs and stepped into the kitchen. 2 strangers were sitting at the table. Beside them was a suitcase. My suitcase. Mom folded her arms. "You won't be living here anymore." And before I could ask what she meant, I saw my father reach for an envelope one of the strangers had placed on the table. "Sit down, Anita." Dad pointed at the empty chair across from the 2 strangers. I didn't move. "Who are they?" The woman looked about 50. The man beside her was older, with gray hair and a careful expression that made it seem like he was just as uncomfortable as I was. Dad grabbed the back of the chair. "George and Helen Walsh, you're going with them." "What?" Mom stepped beside my suitcase. "It's temporary guardianship. Maybe they can teach you how to behave." George quietly pushed an envelope across the table. Dad took it immediately. I stared at his hand. "What's that money for?" Mom's fingers clamped around my shoulder. Enough. That single movement told me more than her answer could have. I looked toward the hallway. Melissa was standing there. "Melissa." She lowered her eyes. I turned back to Mom. "You're actually sending me away." "You made this necessary." I asked why she gets an education. My voice cracked through the kitchen. Mom pulled me into the hallway before I could say anything else. "Please," I whispered. "I won't ask again. I won't touch any papers. Just let me stay." Her expression didn't soften. "Melissa is going to make something of this family. And me. You should be grateful someone is willing to take responsibility for you." Minutes later, I was sitting in the Walshes' car watching my childhood home disappear behind us. I thought I had been sold. That night, however, Helen showed me a bedroom. There was a bed, a desk, and a lock on the door. On the inside. You control that, she said quietly. I stared at her. Then she placed several school enrollment forms on the desk. We're getting you back into school. I could barely speak. Later, voices drifted from downstairs. I stepped into the hallway. George was speaking. I still don't understand why Richard insisted we pay before he would sign the guardianship papers. My hand tightened around the railing. The envelope. It really had been money. The next morning, Helen placed the guardianship documents on the kitchen table. You're old enough to understand what people are signing about your life, she said. I read every page. Then, while Helen made breakfast, I took the small camera George had lent me and photographed every single sheet. For the first time, my parents weren't the only people holding the evidence. You're not going to embarrass your sister today. Mom cornered me beside the hallway at a family gathering months after I had moved in with George and Helen. It was the first time I had seen my parents since they sent me away. Across the room, Melissa stood surrounded by relatives while Dad talked proudly about her academic plans. She's going all the way, he announced. University, graduate school, maybe even a PhD. Then Mom glanced at me. Unfortunately, school was never Anita's strength. Several relatives looked over. I could have stayed silent. That was what my parents expected. Instead, I said, actually, I'm back in school. Mom's smile disappeared. My grades are good, too. Dad crossed the room immediately. Anita, outside. No. The room went quiet. His jaw tightened. Then he lowered his voice. Do you still have those guardianship papers? That question hit harder than any insult. He wasn't asking whether I was happy. He wasn't asking about school. He wanted the documents. Why? They're family business. Give them back. Helen stepped between us. They concern Anita. She has every right to keep copies. Dad looked at her. This doesn't involve you. It involved me the moment she entered our home. For once, Dad had no authority over the adult standing beside me. He walked away without answering my question. Later, in the car, I turned to Helen. What was in that envelope George gave him? She hesitated. Your father demanded reimbursement before he would consent to the guardianship. For what? He claimed expenses. I stared through the windshield. So he really took money to let me leave. Helen nodded slowly. But Anita, there's something else. She pulled out the copied guardianship paperwork and pointed to several references I hadn't understood at 15. I've been looking at these. My eyes moved across the page. Helen tapped one line. I don't think that payment is the biggest thing your parents hid from you. 17 years after I scratched those first marks into the basement beam, I was sitting at my own desk with my parents' paperwork spread in front of me. I had finished school. Then I kept going. Every qualification I earned became something my parents had once decided I wasn't worthy of having. George and Helen never bought my success for me. They gave me something more important, the chance to pursue it. And I kept every document from the day they took me in. One evening, while reorganizing those records, I noticed a reference on an old page. An account. Then another document mentioned education-related disbursements connected to my name. I stared at the dates. That can't be right. I began requesting the records I was legally entitled to obtain. When they arrived, I covered my dining table with them. One payment. Then another. Then another. Money associated with my care and education had repeatedly entered accounts controlled by my parents. But during those same years, I had been pulled from school. Melissa hadn't. I opened another statement. A payment connected to me appeared shortly before one of Melissa's major education expenses. My hand stopped moving. Suddenly, Dad's questions from the basement returned word for word. What papers did you see? Did you see any account numbers? Did you tell anyone about Melissa's tuition? I had thought they locked me downstairs because I challenged their favorite daughter. Now the dates suggested something worse. My question had brought me dangerously close to their money. And Dad's strange sentence finally made sense. We only kept you for legal reasons. I still needed the complete paper trail before confronting them. Then another piece moved into place. Richard and Diane had spent years borrowing against the house where they raised us. Eventually, their finances caught up with them. The property was going up for sale. I stared at the listing for a long time. Then I called the appropriate professionals and made a legitimate offer through the normal process. I didn't contact my parents. I didn't threaten them. I simply bought the house. By the time Richard and Diane discovered who the buyer was, the transaction was complete. I returned alone. The kitchen looked smaller than I remembered. Then I opened the basement door. My feet stopped on the final step. There, beneath years of dust, were the scratches. The lines I had carved at 15 were still in the wooden support beam. I touched them once. Then I went upstairs and placed a thick folder on the kitchen table. The front door suddenly opened. Dad stormed inside. "What are you doing in?" He saw me. Then he saw the folder. And Richard Carter froze. Dad stared at the folder. Mom entered behind him, stopped in the doorway, and looked from me to the papers. "What is this?" she asked. I pulled out the first set of records. The answer to the question I asked when I was 15. Dad's face hardened. "Anita, whatever you think you found." "I found the money." He went silent. I laid the records across the kitchen table, documents connected to my care, education, and the accounts my parents had controlled while I was a minor. "You told me Melissa deserved an education, and I didn't. But money designated for my welfare and education was coming under your control." Mom folded her arms. That money supported this family. And somehow supporting this family always meant supporting Melissa. I placed the dates side by side. The pattern was clear. Funds connected to me had been diverted into household expenses and costs that benefited Melissa's education, while I was denied the same opportunity. Then I showed them the guardianship documents. And when I started asking questions about her tuition, you locked me in the basement. Dad slammed his palm against the table. "You were a child. You had no idea what was happening." "Exactly." My voice stayed level. "I was a child. I had no money, no authority, no transportation, no adult in this house willing to protect me. That's why what you did matters." Neither of them answered. I finally understood Dad's words from 17 years earlier. They had kept legal control over me because that control also meant control over funds designated for me. When I saw paperwork connected to Melissa's tuition and began asking questions, they became afraid I would expose the discrepancy. So they tried to fright me into silence. When that stopped working, Dad demanded payment before consenting to George and Helen taking guardianship of me. They had called me worthless while finding ways to extract value from my existence. Mom shook her head. "We did what was necessary for the family." "The family?" I looked directly at her. "You mean Melissa?" By then, Melissa had also learned what the records showed. She could no longer dismiss my childhood as jealousy or rebellion. Part of the opportunity she had received had come, while resources meant for me were being controlled elsewhere. I never blamed her for being a child inside the same family. But her relationship with our parents fractured once she understood what they had done. The relatives who had spent years believing I was sent away because I was difficult finally saw the documents too. Dad's version of me collapsed. I preserved every record and pursued the financial and legal remedies still available to me. I wasn't interested in threats or revenge outside the law. The truth was enough. Then Dad looked around the kitchen. His kitchen. At least, it used to be. Why would you buy this place? He demanded. You hate everything about it. I looked toward the basement door. I didn't buy it because I wanted to live here. Mom stared at me. Then why? Because the last decision ever made about my life inside this house was going to be mine. For years, they had borrowed against the property until their finances finally forced them to sell. Now the sale was complete. The house belonged to me. And under the terms of that sale, they had to leave. Dad opened his mouth, but there was nothing left for him to order me to do. Before they went, I handed Mom the folder. A gift. Inside were copies of the guardianship paperwork, the financial records, and a photograph I had taken that morning of the marks still carved into the basement beam. Mom slowly turned each page. Then she reached the last one. It was a copy of my highest educational credential, the education they had tried to deny me. Beneath it, I had written, "You spent years paying for one daughter's education with what belonged to the other, so I finished mine without you." Mom lowered the page. Dad looked away. I kept only one thing from that basement, a small piece of the marked wood that documented the days I had once counted while waiting for someone to open the door. I remained close to George and Helen, the two people who gave me a safe room, returned me to school, and taught me that guardianship could mean protection instead of ownership. I never rebuilt my relationship with my parents on their terms. I didn't need their permission anymore. They once locked me beneath their house because I dared to ask why I didn't deserve an education. 17 years later, I walked out holding the deed, and they were the ones who had to leave.